Welcome to Brainish English Stories.
The man who liked to dream big decided to throw a party at one of his imaginary castles and invited some important people. The castle, though not as grand as others in the area, was still very impressive, like nothing you'd see on Earth. It was built from dark, heavy clouds that hung over the land all day. The men wanted it to look cheerful, so he covered it in gold when the sun started to set, making it shine beautifully. If people from below looked up, they might have thought the castle was just a bunch of clouds lit up by the sun. They couldn't see it for what it really was because they lacked imagination. But if they could enter the castle, they'd realize that what the mind creates can feel more real than the ground beneath our feet. When it was time for the party, the host waited in a big room to greet the guests. The room had tall pillars made of clouds and was lit by shiny meteors hanging from the ceiling. The light was soft and gentle, making everyone look their best as they walked in. The first guest was an old man dressed in old-fashioned clothes, leaning on a stick. He looked around the room and asked if it was built to last. The host assured him it was sturdy enough for the party. This guest was well known for remembering past events, like hot Sundays and cold Fridays. He was so old that his memories filled newspapers, but his home was hidden by newer buildings. He was the oldest inhabitant, a friend of time. The host tried to chat with him, but the old man was tired from traveling through the clouds and needed to rest. Then the host noticed another guest standing quietly in the shadows. "Hello there," said the host, shaking the hand of a quiet guest who had been overlooked. "You're the star of the night. Even if no one else came, your presence would fill this place." "Thank you," replied the modest stranger. "I've been here since early. I'll stay even after everyone else leaves, if that's okay." Who do you think this guest was? It was the famous doer of impossible things, a person with extraordinary abilities and virtues, although some say he has weaknesses too. He's known for putting others first and living a simple life. He doesn't care about trends, opinions, or fame, living by his own high standards. Some say he can solve impossible math problems, create machines that run forever, make water flow uphill, write epic poems, and even swallow himself whole. But despite his talents, he's not considered part of polite society. In fact, it's seen as bad if he shows up at fancy events. Public speakers, teachers, and actors avoid him. For special reasons, we won't say his name, but here's one more strange thing about him. When he looks in a mirror, he sees nobody there. Then, more guests arrived, including a lively little man known for gossip, Monsieur Ondet. He spoke many languages and had secrets to share with everyone. After whispering to the host, he promised to spread the word about the party in the lower world. He chatted with everyone, even waking up the oldest inhabitant to share some news. "What's that?" asked the old man, surprised. Monsieur Ondet repeated his message, astonishing the old man. Next came the weather clerk, invited out of respect for his job, though he wasn't very exciting. He chatted with the oldest inhabitant about old storms and windy days. The host was glad they got along so well. Then there was the wandering Jew, who showed up at every party. He looked out of place in his dusty clothes and soon left for another adventure. More guests arrived, shadows from the host's past dreams. He invited them to see how they compared to real people. But they were just silly, exaggerated versions of real friends and heroes. The dream lady, once so perfect, now seemed like a fake doll with pretty words and no real heart. The host politely greeted her, hiding his amusement at her unreal perfection. "No, no, dear lady," chuckled the host, "I've changed my taste. I prefer what nature creates over my own creations in the form of women." "Oh, "You deceitful man!" cried the dream lady, pretending to faint before vanishing into thin air, her voice echoing sadly. "Your change of heart has destroyed me." "Good riddance," muttered the man of fancy to himself. Alongside these shadows came an unwanted crowd of shapes that had tormented him during his darkest moods or feverish dreams. They slipped past the castle walls and haunted the grand hall. There were terrors from his youth, ugly creatures that lurk in children's nightmares. He was startled by the sight of a deformed old woman who had scared him during a childhood illness. Now, she grinned among the pillars, reminding him of long-forgotten fears. It amused him to see her peek into the mind of the oldest inhabitant. "I've never seen such a face," exclaimed the old man, astonished. After these unreal guests, a group arrived that some might consider too perfect to be real. There was an honest patriot, a wise scholar, a humble priest, and a beautiful woman without vanity. There was also a happy married couple, a reformist unbound by rules, and a poet free from envy. The host invited them out of respect for society's ideals, although he knew such perfect people were rare. "In my youth," said the oldest inhabitant, "these types were everywhere. But these perfect guests were not as interesting as those with flaws." Then a stranger arrived whom the host greeted with great respect. He was a young man in simple clothes, but with a brilliant mind shining from his deep-set eyes. He was the master genius, destined to create great American literature. Many ignored him, but he was unconcerned, knowing his work would outlast generations. Monsieur Ondit spread the news about the master genius, but some guests doubted an American genius could exist. "We already have good poets," said one. "We don't need better ones." And the oldest inhabitant, when offered to meet the master genius, declined, saying he preferred the poets of his time. More guests arrived, including Davy Jones, a famous sailor, and an old man known as Old Harry, who cleaned up nicely and became Venerable Henry. There were also fictional characters like Joel Doe and Richard Roe, along with a man of straw and others only existing as voters in elections. Seatsfield, thought to be fictional, turned out to be a real man from Germany. Finally, a guest arrived from the distant future. "Do you know him? Do you know him?" whispered Monsieur Ondit, who seemed to know everyone. "He's from the future, representing posterity." "And how did he get here?" asked a figure resembling a fashion icon from a magazine, symbolizing passing trends. "He's trespassing on our territory by coming before his time." "But remember where we are," replied the man of fancy, overhearing. "In a castle in the air, where posterity can meet us on equal terms." Once his identity was known, many guests surrounded posterity, showing interest and boasting of their sacrifices for him. But posterity grew impatient. "Please, focus on your own affairs," he exclaimed, breaking free from one guest. "I owe you nothing. Live wisely for your own time if you want to be remembered by me." "It's nonsense," murmured the oldest inhabitant, feeling ignored. "To waste so much thought on the future." To distract the guests, the man of fancy led them through several rooms of the castle, each more splendid than the last. In one room filled with moonlight, ideal statues stood illuminated, representing works never fully realized. Another room held a library of planned but unwritten books, including works by famous authors. The oldest inhabitant was puzzled by these peculiarities. "My brain isn't as clear as it used to be," he admitted. "You young folks must understand these things better." With little reply to the confusion, the man of fancy led them to another room filled with golden sunbeams, adorned with curtains made of sunrise clouds and scattered rainbows. This room contained forgotten joys from the lower world, enough to supply a lifetime of happiness. The guests felt rejuvenated, and even the child unborn frolicked among them, spreading joy to all who witnessed his playfulness. "My esteemed guests," said the man of fancy, "I invite you to the banquet hall, where a small feast awaits." "Well said," exclaimed a thin figure, accustomed to dining alone. "I was beginning to wonder if a castle in the air had a kitchen." Curiously, the guests quickly abandoned their moral discussions for the promise of food and drink. They followed the host into a grand hall, where a table glittered with golden dishes and drinking vessels. The head of the table, beneath an ornate canopy, was offered to the oldest inhabitant, but he declined, opting for a bowl of gruel and a nap. Instead, the master genius of the country was honored with the seat, much to the approval of the company. A banquet was served, including delicacies from far-off lands. A phoenix roasted in its flames, cold potted birds of paradise, and celestial desserts pleased the guests. As for drinks, there was water from the fountain of youth, Nepenthe for the ladies, and Lethe for the sorrowful. The more distinguished guests were rumored to sip nectar from a golden vase, aged since classical times. After the meal, speeches were made, with the clerk of the weather warning of an impending thunderstorm. Panic ensued, and guests hurried to leave. The oldest inhabitant, true to his courteous nature, expressed gratitude for the evening before being whisked away by the wind. As the tempest blew out their lights, the fate of the guests returning to earth remained uncertain. Whether they safely made it back or remained lost in the realms of imagination is a mystery. Perhaps it's a lesson to consider the consequences before venturing into the unknown pleasures of nowhere.